Let me begin with a statement that is simple but not naive. I do not want another world war. Yes, I do not want another world war. Not because war is frightening, although it is, but because when one studies the architecture of modern conflict through the lenses of international law, technological acceleration, and systemic interdependence, one recognizes a particular moment in which regional conflicts, they cease to behave as regional conflicts. They begin interacting with the structural infrastructure of the international order itself. And that is the moment we may be approaching now. The war around Iran today is not dangerous simply because military operations are taking place. It is dangerous because it sits at the intersection of 5 destabilizing systems simultaneously. Global energy infrastructure, socio-economic stability, nuclear governance, alliance security architecture, and increasingly AI-mediated conflict environments. Individually, each of these domains is manageable, but together they create the architecture through which regional war becomes systemic escalation. Modern geopolitical stability, it rests on a foundation that is often invisible. Yes, energy logistics. The Strait of Hormuz, it is not merely a maritime passage. It is one of the primary circulatory arteries of the global industrial system. A significant share of global oil and liquefied natural gas shipments, they move through that corridor. When conflict threatens that infrastructure, the effects, they propagate almost immediately through energy markets. But energy shocks do not remain confined to commodity markets. Energy prices determine transportation costs. Transportation costs, they determine food prices. And food prices, they influence political stability. In political economy literature, this is known as the transmission chain of geo-economic shock. History has shown that disruptions in energy supply can rapidly translate into inflationary pressure, economic contraction, and social unrest. In other words, the battlefield, it extends far beyond the geographic theater of war. It extends into the daily economic survival of societies across the world. Economic instability generated by war, it does something extremely dangerous. It alters political incentives. Governments facing inflation, energy shortages, financial volatility, they must respond to domestic pressure. In such environments, political leaders, they often become less able, not merely less willing, to pursue diplomatic compromise. Domestic legitimacy, it becomes tied to perceptions of strength and resolve. This is a classic escalation mechanism documented in international relations scholarship. Economic crises tend to empower political factions that favor confrontation rather than restraint. Thus, the socio-economic consequences of war can gradually reconfigure domestic political landscapes across multiple states, increasing the probability of further geopolitical confrontation. What begins as regional conflict, it can therefore produce distributed political radicalization across the international system. What distinguishes contemporary conflicts from those of earlier eras is the growing role of artificial intelligence in security systems. AI increasingly shapes intelligence analysis, surveillance interpretation, cyber operations, battlefield decision support. These technologies, they compress the time available for strategic decision making. Where escalation once unfolded over days or weeks, it can now occur within minutes. The problem is not merely technological, it is institutional. The governance mechanisms designed to regulate conflict, like diplomacy, international law, crisis negotiation, they were constructed for slower decision environments. When technological systems they accelerate conflict dynamics beyond the pace of governance, the probability of miscalculation rises dramatically. This creates a dangerous asymmetry. The speed of war increases while the speed of restraint remains constant. Large-scale wars rarely begin because leaders deliberately seek them. They emerge when decision makers underestimate how interconnected the system has become. The First World War escalated from alliance entanglements and mobilization timetables. The Second World War, it emerged from economic collapse and geopolitical revisionism. And today's world, it is far more interconnected than either of those periods. Energy networks, financial markets, technological infrastructures, supply chains, they all form a global system whose stability it depends on predictability. War introduces unpredictability. When unpredictability spreads across multiple systems simultaneously, the international order becomes fragile. When you study conflict through the lens of international law, global political economy, technological transformation, you begin to recognize certain patterns. Some wars, they remain limited. Others, they interact with the structures that hold the international system together. When that interaction begins, the character of the conflict, it changes. The war around Iran today has begun to touch those structures, and that is why it matters. Every large war, it begins as something smaller. At the moment, the conflict is still described as a regional confrontation. Military strikes, retaliation, strategic signaling between states and allied actors. From a traditional security perspective, this appears manageable. States, they have fought limited wars before without triggering global catastrophe. But that assumption, it depends on one condition, that the conflict remains geopolitically contained. The difficulty is that the region where this war is unfolding is not merely a geopolitical space. It is one of the central nodes of the modern world's economic and security infrastructure. Central Asia sits at the center of the world's energy system. The Strait of Hormuz alone, it carries a significant portion of global oil and gas shipments. When conflicts, they threaten that corridor, the impact is not confined to the region. Energy markets, they respond immediately. Higher energy prices, they do not remain confined to fuel markets. They affect transportation, they affect industrial production, and they affect agriculture. In modern economies, energy is embedded in nearly every stage of production. This means a disruption in one maritime corridor, it can alter the cost of food, manufacturing, electricity across multiple continents. At that point, the consequences of war, it moves beyond military strategy. They become global socio-economic shocks. Economic shocks, they do not remain purely economic. When fuel prices rise and inflation spreads, governments face domestic pressure. Political leaders, they must respond to their voters worried about cost of living, employment, economic security. Political science research consistently shows that periods of economic stress reshape political incentives. Governments become more sensitive to domestic perceptions of strength and vulnerability. Under those conditions, diplomatic compromise becomes politically difficult. Hardline positions become politically safer. The result is that economic disruption caused by war can indirectly produce more confrontational geopolitical behavior across multiple states. Thus, a regional conflict, it begins influencing political dynamics far beyond its immediate geography. Another dimension rarely integrated into security analysis is the vulnerability of humanitarian systems. Hospitals, medicines, medical supply chains, food distribution networks, these are often framed as humanitarian concerns, but they are also stability infrastructures. When conflict, it disrupts medical logistics, evacuates hospitals, or damages essential infrastructure, societies lose their capacity to absorb shocks. Humanitarian collapse, it produces displacement, and displacement, it produces migration flows, and migration flows, they create political pressures in neighboring states and beyond. These pressures, they reshape domestic politics. In the case of Iran today, another variable enters the equation: nuclear infrastructure. Whenever military conflict intersects with nuclear facilities or nuclear materials, uncertainty becomes a central strategic factor. Verification becomes harder, information becomes incomplete, decision makers must act under conditions of ambiguity. Strategic studies have long demonstrated that uncertainty, it increases escalation risk. When states cannot accurately assess the capabilities or intentions of adversaries, they tend to adopt precautionary strategies that may appear aggressive. In other words, nuclear uncertainty, it compresses the margin for miscalculation. One of the defining characteristics of contemporary warfare is the growing role of artificial intelligence and digital systems. AI increasingly assists in intelligence analysis, surveillance interpretation, cyber operations, battlefield decision support. These systems, they accelerate the speed at which information is processed and decisions are made. That acceleration, it creates a structural problem. Diplomacy, international law, crisis management institutions, they were all designed for conflicts that evolved over longer time frames. Negotiation, verification, political deliberation, they all require time. When technological systems compress decision cycles, the space for restraint becomes smaller. Escalation can occur faster than the mechanisms designed to prevent it. Each of these factors, energy disruption, economic instability, humanitarian stress, nuclear uncertainty, technological acceleration, they can exist independently. The danger arises when they begin interacting. Energy shocks, they produce inflation. Inflation, it generates political pressure. Political pressure, it hardens geopolitical positions. Humanitarian crises destabilize regions. Technological acceleration reduces the time available to manage these risks. At that moment, the conflict no longer behaves like a traditional regional war. It becomes a systemic risk to the international order. The reason I began with the sentence, "I do not want another world war," is because history shows how such wars actually begin. They rarely start with deliberate global confrontation. They emerge when leaders, they believe a conflict can remain limited even as the structures surrounding that conflict begin to destabilize. The world today is far more interconnected than in previous eras. Energy systems, financial markets, technological networks, supply chains, they all form a complex architecture that supports global stability. When war begins interacting with that architecture, the consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield. Ending this war is not simply about preventing further violence in one region. It is about preventing a conflict from interacting with the foundational systems that sustain global stability. International law was built precisely to manage such risks, to prevent conflicts from escalating beyond control. Whether the international community can still perform that function remains an open question. But the stakes are clear, because if the interaction between war and global systems they continue to deepen, the consequences will not remain regional, they will become global. And that is precisely the outcome we must avoid. Thank you.